Hello, my name is Ryan Kawaguchi, and my presentation is on assisting public library patrons with invisible disabilities, and this presentation was prepared for Library 218, taught by Professor Jean Beddard. I would first like to cover the Americans with Disabilities Act and invisible disabilities. And now, while the Americans with Disabilities Act says very little about people with invisible disabilities, it generally includes them in Title I of the Act, and in Title III of the Act, libraries are covered as a public accommodation. And well, most library augmentations, aside from signs and verbal communication, are not necessary to assist most individuals with high-functioning autism, mental illness, and learning disabilities. Okay, so what is an invisible disability? We first have the medical model, which is basically that covers the medical conditions which are defined as being invisible disabilities. Then we have a sociological model, which is presented to us by Ann Davis, and this also includes what the issues which people with invisible disabilities may confront when asking for accommodations. Okay, there are three examples that I'm going to cite of invisible disabilities. The first one is Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum disorder. The second one is mental illness in general, and the third one is learning disabilities. Okay, so what is Asperger's syndrome? Now you may be wondering, why is the person who is making this presentation, why is he stuttering and sometimes reading some of the slides? Now it is because this person has Asperger's syndrome, and Asperger's syndrome is a autism spectrum disorder, so it's part of a broader group including classical autism and other syndromes such as Rett syndrome. That was first identified as a separate disorder from autism by pediatrician Hans Asperger. And people with Asperger's have trouble with social interaction, including nonverbal and eye contact issues, and they may be very obsessed with certain things. Another issue is that people with Asperger's may often take things very literally. There are 4 tips for dealing with patrons who have Asperger's syndrome in the public library. The first one is to speak to them directly, which is something I mentioned before. Don't use figures of speech, and don't speak in idioms or similes or metaphors. Second one is you don't usually need to use assistive devices to help them, but currently you have iPods and iPhones, computers, which you can download apps to, which can provide them with assist them with activities of daily living, such as using the public library. Now, another thing is to be lenient about lending policies if a person will return materials at the end of lending period. However, don't make changes to lighting, seating, and or the general layout of the library without first consulting members of the community with autism. Okay, learning disabilities. According to the ASCLA, 1 in 7 Americans has some type of learning difference. And examples of learning disabilities include dyslexia, which is reading, dysgraphia, which is writing, dyscalculia, which is math, and certain sensory integration issues, and ADHD. And as you saw on the last page, a major intervention that you can use in a public library to assist people with learning disabilities is to include multisensory kits, which offer stimuli such as visual and maybe tactile, which is touch, and hearing, so you don't have to not just merely expect them to read text, because they may have trouble with reading text. Next one is selective seating, so you may want to seat your patron in the front in a presentation or some kind of a talk or something. Also present in a visual as well as written style, because your patron with dyslexia may not understand it. And third is don't judge, which is obvious. Next one is most devices should allow individuals to check spelling and grammar, and that would include most current word processors. The final topic I shall cover is mental illness. Now, mental illness is a very broad invisible disability, and mental illness can include severe impairments such as schizophrenia, but can also include mild personality disorders such as bipolar, dissociative, etc. The patron with mental illness may not experience any difficulties while in the library, but the possibility of a disruption cannot be excluded. And there's a tendency to see them as problem patrons, but a lot of the time we have to realize that they are explicitly covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act and accommodate them if at all possible. Okay, when you deal with a mentally ill person in the library, don't treat them differently from other people, and provide signs, which is all similar to Asperger's and learning disabilities, and don't stereotype them, and help other people to understand that they have a disability. And if you're a librarian, seek advice from community organizations for the disabled, because they'll help you understand how to deal with them and maybe provide some information. And provide outreach to community institutions where people with mental illness are common. Okay, at the end of this, I have concluded that invisible disabilities are not as apparent as physical disabilities, but in a lot of ways they require the same level of accommodation, even if by different means. So you might need to have signs there, and that might be cheaper, but you also need to understand that people with invisible disabilities are going to be debilitated just as much as a physically disabled person, and they are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act just as a physically disabled are. And their need for assistive devices is different than a person with physical disabilities, but is still present. And other patrons may not understand why a seemingly healthy person is being assisted as if they were physically disabled. But it is the library's staff's job to assist a patron and provide for the other patron with information, help them understand the nature of a disability.